Hello, chess fans. Today we are looking at the greatest chess game of all time, Kasparov versus Topalov 1999. We are going to be breaking this game down one move at a time so that everyone, but especially beginning and intermediate players, can enjoy this great game. Anytime you say that something is the greatest of all time in a sporting setting, you're going to generate debate. But I really think that there is a consensus in the chess world that for the moves played on the board, for the sporting setting of the game, and also for the variations that lay behind the scenes, this deserves to be called the greatest chess game of all time. The historical context is that Kasparov, very arguably the greatest chess player of all time, had actually been defeated 2 years earlier by the computer Deep Blue. His rating had actually fallen back a bit, and he had not competed in serious tournaments for a little while, so there were questions about whether his reign was nearing an end. He settled those questions when he won this masterpiece, and also when in this year he reached a record rating of 2851, a record that stood for 14 years until Magnus Carlsen passed it in 2013. Now this game is going to be a long video. It must be to do justice to this game, but if you are down for that, here we go. We're going to move quickly through the opening phase so that we have more time to focus on the great struggle later. Now, Kasparov is a specialist with both e4 and d4, but here he picks the most open option. His opponent Topalov responds with pawn to d6, and this is an introduction to the less popular Pirc defense. This is a you're darned if you do, darned if you don't situation with Kasparov. If you play a main line, he's the greatest opening theoretician of all time, so you're going to find that he's got something cooked up for you. Or you do something like this here, which is probably a little bit inferior, and then you're testing the greatest player of all time in new waters, which is also going to be tricky. We get d4 from Kasparov, establishing that perfect pawn center, and then we get knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn, and knight to c3, developing and defending. This is a difference between the Pirc and the King's Indian defense. Both involve the same setup here with d6, knight f6, and a kingside fianchetto over here. But in the King's Indian defense, you don't block the c-pawn with your knight. Instead, that c-pawn advances early on. So that is a major structural difference that has significant strategic implications. So after knight c3 here, we get pawn to g6, getting ready to fianchetto. We get bishop e3. Kasparov is first developing his queenside pieces because he's anticipating quick queenside castling. Now bishop g7, completing that fianchetto, and queen to d2. Kasparov is getting ready again to castle queenside, and he's also making a battery so that he can try for bishop h6, exchanging off the dark squared bishop that is an important part of Black's game plan. Now we get pawn to c6. This is a flexible move here that is not committing yet to kingside castling when Kasparov is ready to attack that king, or committing to a presence in the center of the board when Kasparov can play against that presence. After pawn to c6 here, we get pawn to f3, a very important move in these structures because you're defending e4 and you're keeping Black's knight out of g4 when Black might be able to exchange off your important dark squared bishop. And now b5, an expansion on the queen side that again stays flexible in the center and doesn't commit the king yet. And since Kasparov is indicating that he's going to castle queenside, we're already readying a potential pawn storm on that side of the board. Now we get knight g to e2. This might actually be a little suspect. Better might be not to block this bishop and to develop the bishop to d3 before putting the knight on e2. But in any case, this is still a very complex position. And now knight bd7 from Topalov brings out the knight to an important square where it's controlling the dark squares. And he's thinking about, when the timing is right, pushing a pawn to e5 or c5. Now we get a very interesting decision from Kasparov. He plays bishop h6. I already told you that he was thinking about exchanging off the dark squared bishop, but this is a very early place to do it. Black hasn't yet castled kingside. So Topalov's going to try to exploit that. He takes on h6, and after Kasparov recaptures, his queen is offsides, and the next phase of the game is focused on Topalov trying to get a presence in the middle of the board and expand there, while Kasparov's queen is on the far reaches of the chessboard. Topalov continues with bishop to b7, further developing, and you're already thinking at this point that he's probably going to castle queenside. Now Kasparov takes a little time out, and he plays a3 to stop the pawn from advancing to b4 and chasing away his knight on c3. At this point, Topalov commits in the middle of the board, pawn to e5. Now with this move, he's actually indicating also that his queen is going to step up to the e7 square, where it's going to be very important for influencing the dark squares in the middle of the board. And he's really doing this partially in response to bishop h6 from Kasparov, which sidelined the queen and exchanged that bishop that was also helping cement the dark squares in the middle of the board. After pawn to e5, Kasparov goes ahead and decides it's time to castle queenside here. And now we do follow through with queen to e7 from Topalov, who's ready to castle queenside himself. And Kasparov makes a grandmaster move here, king b1, very instructive. King b1 is a move you often want to play when you castle queenside because it's going to tuck the king away a little bit, avoiding some potential future checks. And in this case, we have a very tangible thing that we're achieving, which is the freedom for this knight to go to c1. That knight is awkwardly placed on e2, so we're looking forward to repositioning it here, going to c1, and then on to b3 is going to be a perfect repositioning. Pawn to a6 cements the b5 square for black, and that's going to allow later on this pawn to advance without the b5 pawn hanging here to the knight and to the bishop. So after pawn to a6, we get that repositioning here with knight c1, and Topalov does follow through by castling queenside right here. We follow through again, knight b3. That knight completes a nice journey here, and Kasparov's feeling pretty good. He's got his pieces on good squares, and the question is, what is Topalov going to do next? Topalov decides that there's not a good way to continue improving his position right here, so it's time to seek direct action in the middle of the board. He takes here on d4. Now, he's doing this to try to advance in the middle of the board while Kasparov has a rook on h1, a bishop on f1, and a queen on h6 that are all a bit out of play, ill-positioned for a central fight. On the downside, he's got his king in a relatively exposed position, so as Topalov tries to expand and fight for the middle of the board, he's going to have active pieces, but he's going to be worrying about his king as well. After ed, we do get rook takes d4 from Kasparov, and then we get c5 here from Topalov. That's going to kick the rook around, and it frees this b7 bishop. Now we get rook d1, the rook falls back to a nice safe square, and knight b6 is nice because it includes both the rook here and the knight in an attempt to push this pawn to d5 when black's pieces are really starting to hop to life. They're really crackling with a nice energy. Now we get pawn to g3 from Kasparov. He's getting ready to bring his bishop out to the h3 square, which will finally let him include the rook. And Topalov takes time out now to play king b8, another one of those grandmaster moves like Kasparov played with king b1. He's anticipating the action and sliding the king over right away. Now, knight to a5 from Kasparov might be a little bit of a mistake. This phase was conducted with some inaccuracies here. Kasparov is saying, I want to capture your light squared bishop. I think that's a strong piece. But of course, it takes time to bring the knight to the edge of the board here and go after that bishop. And this could have allowed Topalov to strike immediately in the middle of the board with d5, when if you capture the bishop here, black is actually doing pretty well here, even though the king is exposed, because black's pieces are so well positioned and centralized. But it's still a very, very complex game. So in the game, though, the bishop fell back to a8. Topalov decided he needed to keep that bishop, so he didn't seize the opportunity to play d5 right away, which could have allowed Kasparov to pull back with queen f4, making d5 harder to achieve, keeping a nice advantage in this position. But Kasparov felt like he could benefit by playing actively, so he actually played his bishop onto h3, and Topalov decided this was the time, now or never, I'm going to push d5. d5 hits the board, and now things are exploding here. Kasparov immediately repositions his queen with queen a4 check, and the king runs to the a7 square, where it feels relatively safe, at least for the moment. Now rook to e1 completes Kasparov's development here, but it's Topalov's turn and he plays pawn to d4. He's trying to keep things closed in the middle of the board so that Kasparov's rooks aren't able to effectively fight for open lines right here. And he's got a really nice pawn setup in the middle of the board. If the knight just falls back, Topalov has no problems. So in we go, knight d5. Kasparov is not the kind of person who's going to retreat with that knight. He's advancing, and at this point, he's already committing himself to a sacrificial course. At a minimum, he's going to be sacrificing the d5 pawn. So Topalov now exchanges here on d5, and ed opens up the e-file, and immediately Black's queen is under attack from the rook. The queen moves to the d6 square, offering a queen trade, which, if it should happen, would immediately give Topalov the advantage in the position, maybe even a winning advantage if he exchanges queens and he manages to win the d5 pawn. It's Kasparov's turn right now, and you should pause your video if you want to find the amazing move that he played. At this point, Kasparov plays one of the greatest chess moves of all time. Rook takes d4. Boom! This is the first of many, many brilliant moves that are coming from this point onward. After rook takes d4 here, Topalov has an immediate choice. Do you accept the rook sacrifice or do you decline it? In fact, declining the sacrifice is the correct choice. And I kind of love the rook sacrifice even more because it wasn't entirely sound. It's really close to entirely sound, but we're entering a chaos where Black definitely has chances too. This isn't your mate and 8 kind of sacrifice. It's totally complicated and there's nothing but chaos ahead. After rook takes d4, the way to decline was king to b6 right here. After king b6, a very exciting move, you're meeting a rook sacrifice with a simple king move. We have the problem for white that both the rook and the knight on a5 are hanging. That's going to mean we're actually entering an endgame. b4 appears to be the best move, and then after a trade of queens here, knight takes d5 is a good move for Black. We can capture here on f7, but that knight on d5 is attacking b4, so Black is able to go win that pawn on b4. The position's still complicated, but best analysis says that Black is actually doing much better in the positions that are resulting. The problem is that Black's minor pieces are a little better positioned. Black's king is safe now with the queens off the board, and Black's queenside pawns are much better structurally than the kingside pawns that white has. For example, the a pawn is passed. So this was an important opportunity for Topalov. We must recognize that this would have given him a good position, but I think we all appreciate that in the position after rook takes d4, he did choose to accept the sacrifice. Now, I will say that accepting the sacrifice is probably what I would recommend most students to do. My advice when faced with a really complex sacrifice is, if you can't see a reason not to take the sacrifice, then take it. You're either going to win material or you're going to get a great chess lesson. Unfortunately for Topalov, he gets a great chess lesson here and does not get to safely escape with that rook. After rook takes d4, pawn takes d4, we still need to follow up in the correct way, and that is another rook sacrifice. Rook to e7 check. Boom, again. Another immediate and immaculate sacrifice, but this one you cannot accept. After rook e7 check, if you take with queen takes e7 right here, queen takes d4 is a check that forces the king back. The rook sacrifice was so that the Black queen had to fall back to a square where she could not block the check. Now, the king pulls back to b8. We have queen to b6 check here, and then we're forcing mate here, bishop to b7, knight to c6 check, and after the king is pushed into the corner, notice that our bishop on h3 does play a very important role because this square is not available. We have mate here on a7. Great stuff. And if the queen were to block instead of the bishop on b7 here with queen b7, knight c6 is just immediate mate. Again, that bishop on h3 covers that escape square to the side for the king. And of course, the queen on b7 is pinned. Another lovely, lovely checkmate. I should also mention here that after rook e7 check, you could consider here king b8. It's not easy to refute this move either, and the reason this move doesn't work is actually the rook on h8, which is in trouble. Here you can do queen takes d4. You're threatening here queen to a7 checkmate. If you take the rook, then queen b6 goes to the same variation we were just looking at. So it makes sense for black to block on d7. That's the only option left. But whichever piece blocks on d7, when you take it, you have a problem here for black because the rook on h8 is going to be undefended after all the captures. So you get a winning material up position for white here, 2 pawns up and much, much better positionally as well. So after rook to e7 check, because these variations are not working, Topalov does now play the move king to b6. He's sliding his king forward and he is attacking this knight here on a5. Now, Kasparov's going to offer yet another sacrifice here. He's going to give up the knight on a5. Queen takes d4 check. Topalov has another conundrum. Does he block the check here with queen c5, or does he play king takes a5? He did take the knight, but we should look at the position after queen c5. This is also really, really complicated. We can capture a knight here on f6 with check, but that does not end the game. Now, king takes a5 is really bad because of b4 check, forking and winning the queen. But you can try blocking. If the queen goes back to d4 with check, we've done nothing but repeat the position. Well, okay, we did win an extra knight, but we've sacrificed so much that winning a knight was not enough. Here, Kasparov found an amazing way to win the game. That is bishop e6, another boom move. This is just so lovely. It's another great illustration of all the great moves that are not even just happening on the board, but are happening in the variations as well. The thing about bishop e6 is you can't capture this bishop here because rook takes e6 is going to pin and win the queen on d6, getting a winning position here. But if you don't take the bishop, then white is simply keeping all of his pieces on their perfect squares and intending to play pawn to b4 and queen to d4 check. And that threat is massive and pretty much unstoppable. For example, let's say you play your rook over, developing it, trying to exchange the rook on e7. We just respond with b4, and when you capture on e7, queen to d4 is forcing another amazing checkmate right here. You can block with the bishop. I'm going to take the bishop here, and we have another like epaulette style mate here. Queen takes b7. Woo! There are so many beautiful checkmates in here. It's worth taking a moment at each one and just appreciating the many, many different checkmating patterns you'll see in this game. So because of that, or because of some of those lines, Topalov did not block here with queen c5, and instead he did advance and he did take the knight. King takes a5, advancing up the board, and now we do have a mating net here, but it's not easy to get the final checkmate. Pawn to b4 check, king a4, and our mating ideas here are to get queen b3 or rook to a7 and then rook to a6. So getting our pieces into these mating squares is difficult because black has a good number of pieces that are defending, but with imaginative play, we can force the win. Now, in this position, Kasparov actually made a very small mistake here with queen to c3. This is strong, and it eventually won the game, but there were some good defenses that black could have tried. Instead, even stronger, according to analysts, is rook to a7 right away. This move order creates some amazing ideas. There are pages of analysis here, and I'm just going to show some highlights because they're too beautiful not to put on the board. First off, if knight takes d5, you have rook takes a6, another incredible sacrifice, and after rook takes a6, queen takes, you pull the queen back, intending to mate with queen b3, but it's not over yet. You sacrifice the knight here, and then you cover the b3 square. White says, fine, I've got enough reinforcements, pulls the king up here, and you cannot add another defender to b3, so rook c8, queen b3 check, and after the exchange, you have this checkmate. I'm just going to pause here for a second and say, Wow, if this checkmate and the other ones I'm about to show you don't inspire you as a chess player, there's not much I can do for you. White has sacrificed everything. Black has all the heavy pieces remaining, and the king is mated on a4 exclusively by pawns. I mean, I don't even know what to say. I am without words. In any case, let's look at some of these other lines here. There was also rook c8 here instead of knight takes d5. This intends to sacrifice here on c2. After queen d3, when you do sacrifice, this does undermine some of white's pieces that are trying to get to that b3 square because you've eliminated that pawn that we just saw giving checkmate. But after king takes a3, we are still going to be able to checkmate here. Queen c3 check, king a4, and boom again, you sacrifice the rook on a6 to pull the queen offside, and after king b2, there's no stopping queen to a3 checkmate. Another really, really special checkmate, maybe a little less pretty than our pawn mate that we just saw. Also, after rook to a7, you can try bishop takes d5 when that bishop gets out of the corner and defends the b3 square. But here, queen c3, and then rook to e8, and then king b2 again threatens to sacrifice the queen on b3. Rook to e2 is clever because the pawn is pinned, so that if you go queen b3, the bishop will take and you don't get to capture and mate. But here we have queen c7, threatening queen to a5 checkmate, and when black tries to trade queens, it's not a queen trade because we're taking on a6, and we're giving another special and totally different, totally unique checkmate. The best move would be bishop to b7 after this amazing rook to a7 move here. This is like what's going to happen in the game, so we'll head over there in just a second. But after rook takes b7, modern analysis, again, pages and pages of analysis, does show that white is winning in the positions that emerge. So, in the game, after king a4, Kasparov did not play the rook a7 move, which we just looked at highlights from. Instead, he played queen c3, obviously also a very dangerous move because he is again immediately threatening checkmate here. Now, in this position, you've got to defend the b3 square. The way not to do it is bishop takes d5. Unfortunately, after king takes b2, this queen is interfered with because the bishop is on d5. If the bishop is not on d5, then the queen can go to d4 to try to exchange queens and save the day. Also, sometimes you would have some checks that could help out as well in different positions. So the bishop on d5 is allowing king b2 and a forced checkmate here, which we will illustrate. Again, basically the same beautiful, beautiful checkmate that we saw earlier. So instead, we do get the stronger defense. Well, the only defense, queen takes d5 right here instead of bishop takes d5. If king b2 trying for this checkmate over here, you see what I was talking about, queen to d4. This pins the queen on c3, so you're exchanging queens, and black is like, oh my goodness, thank you so much, now I get to win this game. I should point out here that in this position, you could play queen to c7 here. The threat of mate on a5 forces a perpetual check from the black queen, so this is a bailout from Kasparov. If he had not found a way to checkmate in this position or to keep the pressure up, he would have had to bail out with queen c7. But it's important to recognize that he did have a bailout if he got in this situation and didn't see his way to the end, because he didn't see everything right from the beginning. That would have been too crazy, but he saw enough to go down this incredible path. So after queen takes d5, now the rook goes to a7 here. And again, we're threatening rook takes a6 and checkmate. The only defense, because if you try rook to d6, the rook is overworked, and king to b2 is going to threaten queen b3 check. And when you try to trade queens this time, it's a little different than we showed it right before this, because you trade queens and then you mate with rook takes a6. This means, like I was just saying, that the only way to defend the a6 checkmate successfully is bishop to b7, giving up the bishop. So because of that, we now are able to win a bishop. Rook takes b7. Again, you can't take with the queen here. The queen is defending the bishop, but only in a loose sense because of queen to b3 and checkmate. At this point, Topalov picked probably an inferior defense. He tried queen to c4, offering a queen exchange, but better was the move rook to e8, activating that undeveloped rook. Now, this is all really complicated. Again, pages and pages of analysis exist here. We're just going to look briefly at the highlights here. Rook to b6 is considered the strongest move, threatening mate over here. After you defend here, bishop f1, which covers c4, so black can't try to trade queens, is the winning move. The very complicated variation goes rook e1 check. Queen takes e1. You've given up the rook to try to arrange a defense here. Knight to d7, attacking the rook on b6, which doesn't look like it has anywhere to go, but it does have somewhere to go because you go rook to b7, and then the queen captures that rook that went to that defended square. Queen to d1, now the only winning move, and white is actually checkmating with a threat of pawn to c3 check. And the black king is trapped in a mating net. There's no way out of it. White is totally winning in this position. For example, king takes a3 and then just pawn c3 quietly. Let's say we move the knight because we don't have anything better here. And here is the mating net on display. The queen zigzags over to a2 and checkmate. Wow, another position just to sit down and appreciate. I love the position after queen d1. Again, the only winning move. So much exists in the variations in this game. After rook takes b7, again, it was queen c4. You're trying to trade the queens. Topalov missed his chance with rook to e8 to try to get out when, again, very, very difficult for Kasparov to find those lines. Now Kasparov tries queen takes f6. He's of course going to avoid the exchange of queens, and it makes total sense for him to pick off the undefended knight here. He's also threatening queen takes a6 checkmate as well. Now, there's only one more defense you can try here. It is rook to d1 check, and after king b2, rook to a8 here, we have queen b6 threatening queen a5 mate. Black can trade queens, and then after rook takes f7, and there's again a lot of analysis in and around these lines. This is a position where black can try to defend. There's no forced win for Kasparov. He is definitely the one pushing, decent chances to win, but this was the last thing you could try. Instead, after Kasparov played queen takes f6, Topalov used this moment to take here on a3, saying, I'm going to use my king to devour your queenside pawns. If your queenside pawns disappear from the board, you're not going to have enough left to checkmate me. After king takes a3, we get queen takes a6 check, king takes b4. Topalov does succeed in eliminating all the queenside pawns, and for a moment, it just looks like we're running out of steam as white. How do we continue this attack? Kasparov reveals another trick in his position here. He plays the move pawn to c3 check. This another pawn sacrifice is just deadly. There is no good way to capture this pawn or to decline to capture this pawn. Let's look at all the options. First off, queen takes c3 runs into immediate mate because the queen is no longer defending b5. Queen takes, and then we have mate here on the a file just like this. So that was relatively straightforward. After king c5, things are also straightforward. We have rook c7 check and a skewer that is winning the queen here on c4. That's enough to win the game. And if the king goes to b3, we basically have what we have in the game, but it's even easier here. You have queen check, king takes c3, queen check, and then the king is forced into another skewer, bishop f1, and the queen on c4 falls. So after c3 check, it is the king that must capture here. And once again, there's only one winning move for Kasparov. It is queen to a1 check. There's something I love about a queen running to the corner to finish things off. It just indicates that Kasparov is using the whole board in this game. He uses the a1 square. He's eventually going to capture the rook on h8. Bit of a spoiler alert. Everything is getting involved in this magnificent attack. Now, in this position, there's not too many options available to black. If you try king b4, then you run into queen b2 check, queen b3. I'm trading queens. Yay. No, you're not trading queens. I have rook takes b5 here. I've got a decoy and I win your queen. And also, we've already seen the skewer that happens if the king goes to d3 because of bishop f1. So The king goes to d2. The king is trying to run into the center of the board, even to the d1 square, and hoping to survive there. Kasparov does play queen b2 check and king d1. The king has reached the opposite rank. Unfortunately, kings do not get to promote to queens or any other pieces when they reach the opposite rank, and they're generally in a lot of trouble here because you have a lot of pieces to attack with. But in this position, it's actually hard to figure out how Kasparov can continue the attack. Black's queen on c4 is covering all the checks from the white queen. Black's rook on d8 is covering any check from the rook. Is Black's king safe? If Black's king is safe, Black has a ton of threats here, including rook to d2, queen to d3 check. Is Black winning the game? Well, Black is not winning the game, of course. After king d1, bishop f1, boom. This is another sting in the tail. Just when it seems like a combination is concluding, Kasparov reveals that final point over and over again in this game that shows he understood exactly where we were going the whole time. The attack is continuing. He's still winning. The point of bishop f1 is a couple of things. We are attacking the queen on c4 here. That queen does not have anywhere good to go because she needs to defend c2, c1, e2, for example, of queen e6. We have another great checkmate, queen to c1. Love this checkmate. And after bishop f1, if you take the bishop, which is of course the big question, the problem is that the queen is no longer defending queen c2 check. So we're going to give queen c2 check. And the black queen is even getting in the way of the king trying to run to f1 after rook e7, and we force checkmate. The queen blocks. We take the queen. Amazing stuff. So after bishop f1, there's one last trick that Topalov has. It is rook to d2. He's attacking the white queen here, threatening to take the queen with check. And just to illustrate, if you take the rook here on h8, then of course we get to checkmate here with the black pieces. We have queen to a2, which is really, really funny. What a turnaround that would be. Absolute disaster. But how do we deal with this idea of rook d2? Our queen is under attack. If we trade queens by capturing black's queen and they capture our queen, it's just a draw. We're not winning that position. Is there any way to continue the attack? There is, of course. Kasparov again reveals another sting in the tail, a final point at the end of a combination that seems like it's over. It is rook to d7. This ends the game. There's nothing left for Topalov to try here. He is pinning the rook on d2, so it is not possible for Topalov to capture the white queen. That means that Kasparov is threatening checkmate here on d2 with queen takes d2, and he's still threatening the black queen on c4. In this position with no good choices, Topalov does take the rook on d7, allowing his queen to be captured. And final point again, queen takes h8. This rook that's not moved from h8 is vulnerable in the end. We saw queen a1 earlier in the game, and I said, wow, it's wonderful to see the queen using the corner square, using the full board. Now we capture the queen on h8, and again, Kasparov is using the full board. The game is really over here. The queen is stronger than the rook and the pawn that Topalov has, but you do need to be a little bit precise, and we saw a few more moves from Topalov. He played rook to d3, attacking f3, queen to a8, defending f3, pawn here, threatening c2 with check, which would win, queen to a4 check and stopping c2. The king moves over. We get pawn to f4 so that f3 is no longer hanging. Black moves their f pawn so that it's no longer hanging. King c1. Now the c pawn is totally blockaded here, so there's no more real danger for white that you can mess up and let the c pawn advance in a dangerous way. Rook d2 attacking h2, and now queen to a7. If you take on h2, queen g1 check wins the rook right here. Also, queen to e3 check is a threat. Queen takes h7 is a threat. Because of all of this, Topalov decided that this was the right moment to resign this magnificent game. If you like that game and you want to see more games presented in the style of every chess move explained, broken down one move at a time, then you can click over here on the chessboard. I've got some more games I've looked at like this. You can check out that whole playlist. And as always, if you like the content and you want to see more of it, you can subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos.